The year is 1944. The war in Europe, though still raging, has begun its slow, brutal turn. Across the Atlantic, far from the ravaged cities and frontline trenches, a starkly different scene unfolded in American prisoner of war camps. Imagine the biting chill of a late autumn morning in Fort Dix, New Jersey, or the dusty, dry air of Camp Concordia, Kansas. For thousands of German soldiers, defeat meant capture, then transport across an ocean to an alien land. But for a specific, often overlooked group, German female prisoners of war, their arrival brought a particular unsettling surprise. Many expected deprivation, perhaps even cruelty. Instead, they encountered something utterly unexpected, starting with the scent of strong deodorant. It's a detail that feels almost absurd, a sharp, almost sweet fragrance cutting through the usual odors of fear and confinement. What could a simple toiletries item mean in the grand, devastating narrative of global conflict? It's a paradox, isn't it? The sheer incongruity of a seemingly domestic comfort amidst the grim reality of war. Before we delve into the deeper layers of this astonishing chapter, tell us, where are you watching this story unfold from today? Among these women stepping off a crowded transport train and into the unfamiliar American landscape was Helga Schmidt. A young woman barely out of her teens, she had served as a communications aide, her days filled with the crackle of radio static and the urgent whispers of coded messages. Her primary motivation in those final desperate days wasn't ideology, but simple survival, coupled with an insatiable need to understand the vast chaotic forces that had swallowed her world whole. She remembered the coarse, scratchy wool of her uniform, now stained with travel and anxiety, and the pervasive scent of stale sweat that clung to everything. Then, in the intake line, a small white stick was pressed into her hand, its unfamiliar scent a shock to her senses. Overseeing their intake was Captain Eleanor Vance of the Women's Army Corps, a meticulous, observant officer whose clipped voice carried authority, even over the rumble of arriving trucks. Captain Vance had seen her share of battle-hardened men and weary civilians. But these women, disoriented yet defiant, presented a new challenge. She watched Helga's expression, a flicker of bewilderment crossing the young German's face as she examined the deodorant. It was a small gesture, mandated by a directive from Washington, yet Captain Vance knew it was far from trivial. It was part of an intricate, almost invisible strategy. What was it about this strong, American deodorant that so surprised these women, pulling them momentarily from the terror of their situation? And more profoundly, what did they see in these camps beyond the surface comforts that they simply couldn't believe? The answers we'll discover are woven into a story far more complex than a simple act of humanitarian aid, revealing a psychological battleground as intricate as any physical one. This wasn't just about their capture. It was about their minds, their beliefs, and a calculated attempt to reshape the very fabric of their understanding. This wasn't just about their capture. It was about their minds, their beliefs, and a calculated attempt to reshape the very fabric of their understanding. For Helga Schmidt, stepping into the barracks at Camp Concordia felt less like a prison and more like an uncanny, sterile hospital ward. The air, surprisingly clean, carried a faint, clinical scent of disinfectant, unlike the damp, earthy smell she'd come to associate with confinement. Each cot was neatly made with crisp, white sheets, a stark contrast to the rough blankets she'd grown accustomed to. This initial, almost unsettling order was the first layer of an experience designed to disorient, then subtly reorient. The U.S. War Department, even amidst the chaos of global war, had begun to understand that simply holding prisoners was a missed opportunity. As early as late 1943, internal memorandums, like the one drafted by Brigadier General John L. DeWitt, chief of the Western Defense Command, outlined a strategy beyond mere internment. The German women, many of them young, educated, and deeply indoctrinated, presented a unique challenge and a unique opportunity. They were not merely intelligence assets to be interrogated. They were potential conduits for a different kind of influence. They were, in a sense, a blank canvas. Consider the mess hall. Helga, along with hundreds of other German female POWs, found themselves seated at long, polished tables, the clatter of silverware echoing softly in the cavernous space. The food wasn't gourmet, but it was plentiful and varied. Fresh bread, warm coffee, and even meat, a luxury many hadn't seen regularly in years. Dr. Margaret Corbin, a social psychologist assigned to observe the female POW camps, noted in her January 1945 report from Fort Dix, the initial response to American rations is almost universally one of disbelief. Many women inspect their plates as if expecting a trap. The unexpected abundance, the simple act of a full stomach, began to chip away at the ingrained narratives of American weakness and deprivation they had been fed for years. It closed the loop on the immediate fear of starvation, but opened a new, unsettling question. Why this unexpected generosity from the enemy? The strategy extended far beyond food. Inside the wooden barrack walls, away from the watchful eyes of the guards, the women were given access to amenities that felt almost subversive. Not just deodorant, but soap, shampoo, and even basic sewing kits. These weren't random acts of kindness. They were deliberate choices. Captain Vance, reviewing the daily logs from Camp Aliceville in Alabama, noted the consistent requests for hairbrushes and mending thread. These small comforts, she wrote in a confidential memo to her superiors in March 1945, are proving more effective than direct interrogation in fostering a sense of perceived normalcy and, crucially, a willingness to engage. This wasn't about breaking their spirit through hardship. It was about gently unsettling their expectations, making them question the very foundations of what they believed about their captors. It's a peculiar twist of wartime strategy, isn't it? To provide comfort as a weapon, to use the mundane details of daily life to wage a battle of ideology. If you find these hidden layers of history as fascinating as we do, consider subscribing to Whispers from WW2. We delve into these untold stories, uncovering the subtle forces that shaped our past. The camps themselves, like Crystal City in Texas or Camp McCoy in Wisconsin, were designed not just for security, but for a calculated environment. Libraries were stocked, not with propaganda, but with American classics, historical texts, and contemporary newspapers. Helga, initially wary, found herself drawn to the quiet hum of the camp library, the faint smell of old paper and dust a comfort in itself. She remembered the smooth, cool feel of a translated copy of Mark Twain's The Adventures of Tom Sawyer in her hands. By April 1945, reports from librarians across several camps indicated a significant increase in requests for American literature, particularly among younger POWs, a data point that surprised even the strategists in Washington. These programs, from basic hygiene to accessible literature, were meticulously crafted components of a larger, ambitious plan. The question was, could these seemingly benign offerings truly dismantle years of deeply held convictions? And what was the ultimate goal of such an elaborate, almost theatrical re-education effort? These programs, from basic hygiene to accessible literature, were meticulously crafted components of a larger, ambitious plan. The question was, could these seemingly benign offerings truly dismantle years of deeply held convictions? And what was the ultimate goal of such an elaborate, almost theatrical re-education effort? The answer began to Helga Schmidt, initially attending out of curiosity and a desire to fill the long, empty hours, found herself sitting on a hard wooden bench, the scent of chalk dust filling the air, listening to a lecture on the U.S. Constitution. It was a stark contrast to the militaristic education she had known, where every lesson reinforced a singular, unwavering ideology. Dr. Eleanor Vance, reviewing curriculum reports from Camp Ruston, Louisiana, noted the careful selection of texts designed to subtly introduce democratic principles without overt propaganda. The objective, she wrote in her June 1945 operational summary, is not conversion but exposure to present alternatives. This approach, far from the direct indoctrination they had experienced, was disarmingly effective, closing the loop on the question of direct ideological attack, but opening a new one. How did these women reconcile these new ideas with their deeply ingrained beliefs? The psychological impact of these educational programs was profound and varied. Some women, like Helga, found themselves genuinely engaged, drawn by the novelty and the intellectual stimulation. Others remained fiercely resistant, their loyalty to the Third Reich hardening in the face of what they perceived as enemy deceit. Yet, even for the most defiant, the constant exposure to different viewpoints, the quiet discussions that sometimes broke out among the students, began to create fissures in their understanding. Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Johnson, a psychologist attached to the Provost Marshal General's office, observed in his August 1945 assessment of female POW behavior, the most significant shifts are not in overt declarations, but in the subtle nuances of conversational patterns, a willingness to consider a different perspective, even if not yet to adopt it. This wasn't a sudden epiphany. It was a slow, almost imperceptible erosion of certainty, like water wearing down stone. The texture of the rough paper in their workbooks, the scratch of pencils on pages, became symbols of a quiet internal struggle. Beyond formal education, the camps introduced the women to American cultural norms through seemingly innocuous activities. Sports, music, and even informal social gatherings were encouraged. Helga recalled the first time she heard American jazz music played on a scratchy phonograph in the recreation room. The rhythmic, syncopated sounds were so different from the martial anthems and folk songs of her youth, and initially, she found it jarring. But slowly, the infectious energy of the music, the way it made some of the American guards tap their feet, began to penetrate. Captain Vance, in her observations of daily camp life, documented instances where POWs, after initial reluctance, would join in baseball games, the thwack of the ball against a bat echoing across the dusty fields. These interactions, facilitated by a deliberate policy of cultural exchange, were designed to humanize the enemy and chip away at the dehumanizing propaganda that had fueled the war. It was an ambitious undertaking, using shared humanity as a subtle tool of influence. The sheer normalcy of daily life in the camps, contrasted with the brutal realities of wartime Germany, was perhaps the most potent weapon. The consistent supply of clean water, the regular mail service, albeit censored, the predictable routines, these elements stood in stark opposition to the chaos and deprivation many had left behind. Helga remembered the feeling of warm water on her skin during a shower, a simple luxury she hadn't truly appreciated until it was scarce. The U.S. military, through reports from intelligence officers and psychological experts, understood this power of contrast. A declassified memo from the War Department's Special Projects Division, dated July 1945, explicitly stated that providing a stable, humane environment is paramount to fostering cognitive dissonance regarding enemy propaganda. The strategy was not to preach, but to demonstrate, allowing the stark difference between expectation and reality to do the heavy lifting. But how far could this subtle influence go? Could it truly reshape the worldview of women who had been raised in the crucible of Nazi Germany? This subtle influence, however, was not a sudden, universal transformation. The camps became a crucible of conflicting ideas, a place where deeply ingrained beliefs clashed with undeniable, everyday realities. While some, like Helga, began to question, others clung fiercely to their ideology. The true measure of the American strategy lay not in immediate conversions, but in the subtle, observable shifts in behavior and thought patterns. Consider the mailroom, a small, often chilly barrack where letters home were meticulously reviewed by American censors. The air often smelled of ink and stale paper. Initially, these letters were filled with defiant messages, coded references to Nazi loyalties, and thinly veiled contempt for their captors. But by early 1945, a noticeable change began to emerge. Captain Vance, poring over the weekly censorship reports from Camp Ruston, observed a marked increase in requests for American books in the camp libraries. More strikingly, the tone of censored letters sent home started to shift. Dr. Clara Jensen, a German-speaking intelligence officer, tasked with reviewing thousands of these letters, noted in her confidential report of February 1945, "The overt political rhetoric is diminishing. Instead, we see more mundane observations, even a nascent curiosity about American life." One prisoner described the abundance of fresh fruit. Another, the quality of the camp's sewing machines. The initial loop about reshaping worldviews began to close, showing that while not everyone changed, many were at least exposed to a different reality. This, however, opened a new question. What was the true intent behind allowing these letters, and how did their content inform the larger American strategy? The shift wasn't always quiet. Within the barracks, arguments would erupt, hushed voices rising and falling over the clatter of dishes or the creak of wooden floors. Some women, influenced by the education and the unexpected comforts, dared to voice doubts about the Nazi regime. Others, fiercely loyal, would condemn them as traitors. Helga remembered a particularly heated discussion in her barrack one evening, the air thick with tension, about the legitimacy of the Allied invasion. One woman, who had been diligently studying American history, cited facts that contradicted the official German narrative, her voice trembling slightly. Her words were met with a harsh rebuke from another, who accused her of succumbing to enemy propaganda. These internal conflicts, documented by camp administrators and observed by embedded psychologists, were not suppressed. Instead, they were, in a peculiar way, encouraged. Lieutenant Colonel Johnson, in his follow-up assessment in September 1945, noted, "The freedom to debate, even to dissent, within the camp environment is proving a powerful, if sometimes volatile, catalyst for reevaluation. The women are, in effect, interrogating their own beliefs." This closed the loop on the intent of the letters, showing they were a gauge, a thermometer for internal ideological shifts. But how did the American command interpret and react to this internal dissent and the emerging re-education? The answer lay in the increasingly precise directives emanating from Washington. New War Department directives, often relayed via urgent telegrams to camp commanders, began to focus more heavily on cultural assimilation and post-war planning. These weren't just about managing prisoners, they were about shaping future citizens. Captain Vance, receiving a particularly detailed directive in October 1945, noted the explicit instructions regarding democratic principles workshops and vocational training for post-conflict integration. The crisp paper of the telegram felt heavy in her hand. The directives directly impacted repatriation decisions in 1946, prioritizing those who showed signs of ideological flexibility. This closed the loop on how the American command reacted, revealing a calculated, long-term vision. What did this mean for the individual women like Helga and their futures? What kind of relationships did these programs forge between captor and captive, and what lasting impact would they have? If this nuanced look into the hidden strategies of wartime history has made you see things from a different angle, please consider hitting the like button. It helps us know what stories resonate most deeply with you. The seemingly benign environment of the camps, with its strong deodorant, clean sheets, and educational programs, was in fact a sophisticated battleground for hearts and minds. This wasn't just about intelligence gathering, it was about subtly dismantling Nazi ideology and sowing the seeds of democratic thought. The luxuries and educational opportunities were integral components of a calculated psychological operation, turning perceived comfort into a powerful, if ethically complex, tool of influence. The programs created lasting, often complex relationships between some POWs and their American captors, forging unexpected bonds that would echo in post-war reconciliation efforts and personal testimonies. Yet, other women within the camps remained fiercely loyal to their original beliefs, highlighting the profound human ambivalence at the heart of such an ambitious undertaking. This profound human ambivalence, the struggle between ingrained loyalty and new exposure, was the very ground upon which the American strategy sought to operate. It wasn't about forced conversion, but about creating space for doubt, for comparison. Helga Schmidt, for instance, found herself drawn into conversations with some of the younger American staff members, not just guards, but administrative aides and nurses. She remembered one evening, sitting on a worn wooden bench in the recreation hall, the low hum of distant conversation a backdrop, sharing a cup of lukewarm coffee with a young WAC corporal named Sarah. Sarah, with her bright, open demeanor, spoke of her life in Ohio, her dreams of becoming a teacher. It was a simple exchange, yet the warmth of the cup in Helga's hands, the unexpected familiarity of the conversation, chipped away at the monolithic image of the enemy she had carried. It closed the loop on the idea of Americans as faceless aggressors, but opened another. Could such personal connections truly override years of indoctrination? These unexpected bonds, however fragile, were not accidental. Dr. Margaret Corbin, the social psychologist, highlighted in her April 1946 final report on female POW re-education. Interpersonal contact, even brief, with empathetic American personnel consistently correlated with increased receptivity to democratic concepts among the prisoners. The human element proved a potent, if unpredictable, variable. It was a delicate dance, fostering connection without crossing ethical lines, yet always with an underlying strategic purpose. The scent of ink on a freshly signed report detailing such interactions often carried the weight of both progress and moral complexity. For every Helga who found a moment of shared humanity, there were others who saw only a manipulative ploy, strengthening their resolve. Indeed, the camps became sites of quiet yet intense ideological warfare among the prisoners themselves. While some women began to gravitate towards the educational programs and the more liberal perspectives, another faction, often older or more deeply entrenched in Nazi ideology, actively resisted. They would hold clandestine meetings in dimly lit corners of the barracks, the low murmur of their voices barely audible over the general camp sounds, discussing ways to maintain their loyalty and subvert the American influence. Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Johnson, documenting these internal dynamics, noted in his December 1945 psychological assessment, "The formation of countergroups, while challenging, is also indicative of the efficacy of the re-education efforts. It forces a public articulation of beliefs, which in turn often exposes their inherent contradictions." The friction, the clatter of a dropped plate during a tense discussion, was a sign that the strategy was working, not necessarily in converting all, but in forcing internal deliberation. The American command, far from suppressing these internal conflicts, subtly monitored and at times even encouraged them. They understood that genuine ideological shifts rarely came from external pressure alone. They needed to be sparked by internal questioning. Camp administrators at Crystal City, for example, deliberately allowed debates to flourish in recreation areas, observing the arguments from a distance. A declassified memo from the Provost Marshal General's office in early 1946 emphasized the importance of creating an environment conducive to self-critique, rather than direct confrontation. The rationale was clear: a belief system dismantled from within was far more likely to remain dismantled. This closed the loop on the American approach to internal dissent, revealing a sophisticated understanding of psychological warfare. But what were the broader, long-term implications of such a calculated approach, particularly for the women who would soon return to a shattered Germany? The impact extended beyond the individual prisoner's mind, reaching into the very fabric of post-war planning. The observations gathered from these camps, the detailed psychological profiles and the shifts in prisoner attitudes, were meticulously analyzed. They informed not just repatriation decisions, as Captain Vance's directives suggested, but also broader American policies for the denazification and reconstruction of Germany. The goal was not merely to release prisoners, but to send back individuals who, however subtly, carried the seeds of democratic thought. The distant sound of a train whistle, once a symbol of arrival and confinement, would soon represent departure and an uncertain future. Shaped in part by these quiet battles of the mind, the paradox, then, of the strong deodorant and the unexpected comforts, the clean sheets, the plentiful food, the books, was never an act of simple benevolence. It was, from the very beginning, a meticulously orchestrated component of a calculated psychological operation. The U.S. military, through its intelligence and psychological branches, understood that to truly dismantle Nazi ideology, they couldn't just defeat an army. They had to engage with, and subtly reshape, the minds of those who had served it. The camps were not merely places of internment, but laboratories for re-education, turning perceived comfort into a powerful, if ethically complex, tool of influence. The crisp pages of new War Department directives, flowing from Washington, explicitly laid out this ambition: to foster cultural assimilation and sow the seeds of democratic thought, impacting everything from daily routines to eventual repatriation decisions in 1946. Helga Schmidt, stepping onto a repatriation ship bound for a Germany she barely recognized, carried not just her meager belongings, but a transformed perspective, the memory of the deodorant, once a symbol of bewildering kindness, now recontextualized into a sophisticated strategy. The programs had, for many, created lasting, often complex relationships, forging unexpected bonds with their American captors that would echo in post-war reconciliation efforts. Yet, as the final reports from Camp McCoy and Crystal City detailed, other women within the camps remained fiercely loyal to their original beliefs, highlighting the profound human ambivalence at the heart of such an ambitious undertaking. The subtle hum of the ship's engines was a backdrop to a future shaped by these quiet internal battles. This wasn't a story with a simple moral, but one of profound consequence. The American strategy, born from the unlikely juxtaposition of war and deodorant, laid foundational groundwork for denazification and the reconstruction of a shattered nation, one mind at a time. What aspect of this hidden history surprised you the most, or made you think differently about the aftermath of World War II? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and if you're curious about more untold stories that shaped our world, make sure to subscribe to Whispers from WW2.